Hey everybody, welcome back to my YouTube channel. In this video, I'll be showing you how to replace all the components of a shock. The X-rings and spacers, either cap, the shock eyelet, spring, or the shock oil, and the pistons. In this video, these steps will all apply to pretty much every RC car shock. These two shocks are both 10th scale. This is an 8th scale shock and 5th scale. These two shocks are both 10th scale, but there is a difference. This one has a bleed screw, and this one doesn't. This one has a bladder or a diaphragm. I'll be showing you how to bleed both kinds. The first step would be taking it off the car, but if you're bleeding a shock, I'm pretty confident that you'll know how to take a shock off. On both of these, the steps are the exact same with the seals and the eyelet and the piston, except the only difference is the bleeding. So I'll show you on this shock. And this shock, you can see it's leaking. So this is the one we're going to work on and fix. Of course, I'm not going to just replace and fix that one shock. I'm going to have all 4 shocks out so they're all maintained at the exact same time and not wonky and off balance and stuff. Before we even start working on the shocks, I'm going to put some gloves on. Okay, now I have my gloves on and we're going to get right into this. The first thing I want to do is take this spring off, and the way you do that is find the slot right there in the bottom spring perch, and you're going to pull back while holding the eyelet, because it's on that, and you pull up on the spring, and you push sideways to get this out, and that X-ring shouldn't be there, it blew out. What I want to do next, after that's off, is to get this top cap off to start getting inside. And what I'm going to use is these shock shaft pliers. These are pretty much a must to work on these shocks. They have these notches to hold the shock shaft and not scratch it while you unscrew this, or big ones to hold the body of the shock, and then you can take off the cap with a screwdriver through the hole. Okay, I might not even need the shock shaft pliers. Yeah, I do. It's pretty hard and slippery. So I'm going to use the bigger opening and not on the threads, just that part. That's all scratched from the spring. Not on the threaded part, on the smooth part. Hold it down really tight, but don't crush it. And stick the screwdriver in and turn it. Okay. Just that little bit. And now we can take it off with our hand. And I can actually hear some pressure being relieved. So yeah, now the cap's off. What we want to do next is drain all this oil out. This is like a cup for mouthwash. So I'm going to drain it out, and this actually looks pretty clean. Sometimes when you do this, it's all black and dirty. There's actually not even that much oil in there. So that's just one shock. That's not even nothing. So since I've done more shocks off camera, this is what the cup looks like now with the rear shocks. I think the rear shocks got a lot of dirt from being kicked up. Now I have 4 empty shocks, and what I'm going to do is take the piston out. The piston is this white thing in there. Sometimes it's black or whatever, but it's that round circle, that big circle that actually is submerged in oil. And the 2 holes, or one, let oil through. So this one, it's a 1.5 millimeter screw right here to get this piston off. On some shocks, it's actually an E-clip to get it off, and those do suck to get off. So what people do, instead of taking the piston off and then the shaft comes out this way, they take this eyelet off right here, and then the shaft comes out this way with the piston already on it. So now I took that screw out. I'm going to pull it And yeah, this comes out, the shock shaft. And I'm going to get just whatever. This is a 1.5 millimeter wrench to grab it. Don't scratch the walls. And yeah, there's a washer on there. But yeah, the piston's out now. Once the pistons are out, this is the next step. This bottom cap right here, this blue cap, it's pretty hard to get off by hand. Oh, this one was good. But I'll show you one that's not easy. This one you can't get off by hand easily. So, if you look, the shock body has a flat spot right here and a flat spot right here. The associated cars come with a turnbuckle wrench. That's what this big opening in the middle is for, to grab onto those two flats. And then I'll use my shock shaft pliers, the small one, to grab the cap and not scratch it and take it off. Okay. So yep, this one's off. And it's pretty dirty. Okay, see how you can see the X-ring right there? My manual told me to build it like that, but the manual online, the updated one, says to not. So I'm gonna fix it right now. Once you have these shock caps off, the bottom, you'll see there's an X-ring. This is a small hex driver. You can just stick it in there and pry from the side to get it out, just like that. And now there should be a spacer. Okay. And then another X-ring. Yep. And on this specific shock, for associated, there's a top hat bushing, which is flanged and thicker on one side. The manual that I built it with told me to just put one on this side, but the online updated one says to put one on both sides. So that's what I'm going to fix now. And after this, we're going to take these O-rings off, this cap O-ring and this bottom cap O-ring. Now these ones probably could be reused, and you know what, I will reuse these, but I do have spares just in case. And we'll also take this adjuster ring off, and this has an O-ring in it also, just to keep it from not moving. That takes kind of a while, so I'll do that as a time lapse. Taking those shock collars off really is a pain. They really hurt your hands to get off. Well, these O-rings we're going to take off. This is a dental pick. Not really dental, but a pick. You can get them at Harbor Freight or whatever. So what I'm going to do is stick it underneath the O-ring. And this one was actually kind of loose. So yeah, take this O-ring off. Perfect. Now the bottom O-ring for that blue cap. So yeah, pretty easy. And I'm going to go clean these, but I'm going to clean them in the sink, not the ultrasonic cleaner, because the ultrasonic cleaner doesn't really take off silicone shock oil that well. And it's easy to get in these threads with a brush. Now that the bodies and caps and shock rings are nice and clean, I'm going to get them ready for installation. Next thing we have to do to prepare this is put these O-rings on. Some shocks don't have O-rings. This associated shock does. So this bottom O-ring goes on where the bottom blue cap is, and this one is the top cap. Yep, just like that. The O-rings are on, and now we'll get it ready for the bottom cartridge. How this shock cartridge goes together is, this is a flanged spacer. One side's smaller than the other. The smaller side goes up towards the bigger. And you can just push that down with a small hex driver. make sure it's aligned nice, and the small side is facing the bigger end of the shock, just like that. Now, after that is an X-ring. We're going to put that in there, and I just leave it like that. And then the next step is this big spacer. I use this spacer just to push the X-ring down in. Now I can use a small hex driver to push them all down, just like that. Now time for another X-ring. Okay. Now here's the part that the manual didn't put in. This other flanged spacer. This flange spacer, the smaller diameter side faces up. And then once you have that, you put the bottom cap on. But don't put the cap, don't tighten it all the way down. Tighten until there's a little bit of resistance from that O-ring. Because we want to not squish the X-rings when you push the shock shaft in and rip them. Once we have this shock body built, we're going to build the piston and shock shaft assembly. On this specific shock, this is a rear shock, and it uses a 1.7 millimeter hole piston. And what we're going to do is, this isn't loosened, or this is loosened a little bit, it's not tight all the way. And we put it through. Don't force anything, it's all nice and smooth. And you can see that the shock shaft is hollow. What we get is a washer that goes on the shock shaft. Then the thicker flange side goes down towards the shock shaft, and the flat side faces up. Okay, and then it's a 1.5 millimeter screw to screw this piston on. The inside of the shock shaft is threaded. So we screw it in just like this. And you can hold the shock eyelet on the bottom and give it a nice snug. Don't strip that. And now this is nice and free, and we can tighten this down. Now we're on to the step of putting actual shock oil in the shock. What I'm using right here is 35 weight. This is the kit weight. I just ran out of the kit, so I bought some more. It's still 35 weight. I won't get in this video of different weights, but I'm going to use 35. Okay, the shock is empty. The piston stuff's in there. I'm going to pour this in, squeeze it. It's actually really tough to squeeze. This bottle is really stiff. So I'm going to squeeze it until it's up to the top, not flush, but close enough to the top, like that. And work out some air bubbles by moving it up and down slowly and turning the piston side to side, because the thing is, you don't want air inside these shocks. And I already did the other three. This is a shock stand from Duratrax. It's pretty cool because you can just let them sit inside these holes, and you can kind of drop them in there to maybe tap some of that air out of the shock. But yeah, I usually let them sit here overnight, but that's really unnecessary. They could probably sit here for 15 minutes, but whenever I do shocks, I leave them overnight. Those shocks are in the stand. I'm going to show you how to take this pivot ball off and the shock eyelet. So what you want to do is use your shock shaft pliers, these holes right here. And I know this is a 3 millimeter shaft, but I'll show you with some digital calipers. Okay, just like this. Yeah, 3 millimeters. And on the shock shaft pliers, there's a 3 millimeter, I don't know, slot thing. So we're gonna put it like a nutcracker. Put it in the 3mm, closer to the shock eyelet, and then get like a hex driver or something that's the same size as this pivot ball, and you can put it in there and loosen it. It's same regular thread, so you go left. Okay, just like that. And now you can see the threads right there. Here is the shock eyelet, and the same thing to put it back on. And something cool about these shock shaft pliers, it has this pin right here. So if you put the shock pivot in the pin and you put it against that hole, you can squeeze it and it pushes that pivot ball out, and now the shock eyelet is empty. Now in the shocks, if you see no air bubbles going up and down when you push up the piston, then it's good to put that cap back on. So I'm going to show you on a bladder first and then the bleed screw. So what we're going to have is the shock shaft down and the bladder goes on top, and you squish it down in there, and then you press on the shock shaft to get some excess fluid out, like just like that. And now you suck it back in, and that sucks the bladder back in the shock body, and you can wipe that off. Make sure to have some paper towels ready, because this is the most messy job of the shock rebuild process. Okay, now the bladder is like suctioned on there. We can put this cap back on. Make sure it doesn't rip that bladder off. Don't tighten it really tight, just finger tight like that. And now we have a nice built shock, so you can hear no air in there. That's perfect. Now I'll show you the bleed screw shock. On the bleed screw shock, the shock cap has this hole right here with a bleed screw in it. It's a 1.5mm. I'm going to take it out. These shocks don't have a bladder. It's just the cap that goes on. So here's the shock. This one's been sitting all night and it has no air bubbles in it. So what we're going to do is screw the cap back on, or screw it on, yep. Don't cross thread it. Okay, now there's a hole right here. So the shock is all the way down, and we're going to put some paper towels underneath this bleed hole because it gets messy. There's going to be fluid coming out of there. And get our hex driver ready with the screw already on it. So like that. And then we're going to push the shock shaft up like this. And it's going to push the air out. And now we tighten the screw back in there. Okay. Don't strip that screw, it's easy to strip because it's a plastic cap. Now you might think you're done, you're not. You want to pump this up a little bit. Like this. Pump up the shock. And now, when you take this bleeder cap off, you should hear a little hiss, maybe not. But there should be some fluid that comes out when this is pushed in. Yeah, just like that, a little tiny bit of fluid came out, but not enough to drip with needing a towel. So now we tighten this bleeder screw back in. Okay. And yep, perfect shock, no air bubbles in it. And it stays stationary. So if you leave it there, it stays. If you push it in, it's not going to come back out. Now that these shocks are bleeded and ready to put the spring on, I'm just going to clean them up a little bit with some rubbing alcohol. I put it on a paper towel. I'm just going to rub off the cap and stuff so there's not oil. Because if there's oil on the track or in the dirt, then it's going to stick to it. So yep, just like that. I'm just wiping off that bleed screw. If you have a bladdered shock, then you can just wipe it everywhere. Because it's usually around the edge where it gets all oily. On the bleed screw, it doesn't really get oily, except where the bleed screw actually is. This is the manual for my B6.3D. And you can see the spacing between this shock collar and the top of the shock, where the threads are. The front, which is the shorter shock, is 4.2 millimeters, and the back is 8.7. So I'll do that right now. The spring retention collar is back on. Now I put the springs on. This is a rear shock because it's longer. We're going to get a longer rear spring. And see how it has the markings for the spring pound. I have that up so I can see it easier. Like that. Then we're going to squish just the spring down. In my car, the shorter ones are the back. You put it over the shock shaft. It's going to clip like that and slide it down and back on the spring. Nice built shock. So there's a lot of confusion on this shock pivot ball being bigger on one side than the other. So think of my hand as the A-arm. If it's on the A-arm, it's moving and compressing. You want the bigger side facing out. So pretend this is the screw, it's really not. It's going to go in. And you know how we had that pin earlier and hit it with those shock shaft pliers? It can only go in one way. The shock eyelet can't fall off. But if we had this side out, it's going to fall off the end of the screw. So when you mount your shocks, make sure to have the bigger flange side out. Another thing I did, this is my B6.3D, is see, this is a shock regularly on the top. See how it just like kind of flops around? I didn't really like that. It probably works fine, works great. It's designed like this, but I just didn't like that. So here's some O-rings that I found. And this is what I did. Now, I put it back there. I can still move, but it's not sloppy. And it still moves perfectly fine. And I'll leave the link to these O-rings in the description. If you guys like the video, hit the thumbs up button. And subscribe and hit the bell button if you want to see more videos like this.